The final negotiation came down to a vintage, tarnished gold locket, a gift Mark had bought Sarah 10 years ago for $50. "You want to keep the house, Mark? Fine," Sarah said, her voice a low, steady hum. "But I want the full rights and the original seed capital for the Willow project." Mark leaned back in the plush leather chair, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. He laughed, a short, sharp bark that echoed in the lawyer's office. "The Willow project? That hobby? Are you serious, Sarah? You're trading a 7-figure house for a glorified recycling club and a piece of costume jewelry." He gestured dismissively at the locket, throwing it across the mahogany table. It was a cheap victory he savored, unaware that the real trade had just taken place. The air in the 14th floor conference room of Miller & Finch was stale and thick with the smell of old paper and anxiety, a cocktail Mark had learned to find oddly invigorating. He sat opposite Sarah, a massive, polished mahogany table separating them like a moat. The room itself was designed for emotional attrition: cold marble surfaces, uncomfortable charcoal leather chairs, and a panoramic view of the city that only served to emphasize the distance between their current reality and the bright, expensive future Mark felt he was fighting for. It was a grey, early November afternoon, and the light filtering through the vertical blinds cast harsh, clinical stripes across the room, dividing everything into neat, unforgiving segments. Mark, dressed in a sharp, tailored navy suit, his armor, kept his gaze fixed on his attorney, Carol Vance. Carol was a predator in Prada, her silver hair pulled back so tightly her expression seemed permanently stern. She spoke in bullet points, delivering ultimatums with the quiet authority of a market crash. "Let's review, Mrs. Mitchell," Carol began, her voice crisp as breaking ice. "Mark has agreed to a slightly accelerated timeline, provided the asset division remains equitable. Equitable in this case, meaning he retains the primary residence, the Porsche Cayenne, and the majority of the investment portfolio tied to his professional career trajectory at Meridian Group." Sarah, by contrast, looked like she was dressed for a rainy afternoon at a museum. Her jacket, a deep olive green, was soft and slightly worn. Her lawyer, David Chen, a man whose glasses sat low on his nose and whose suit seemed a size too big, only offered gentle, almost hesitant prompts. Mark had privately nicknamed David the Whisperer, convinced he was a sign of Sarah's impending financial collapse. Mark's heart hammered a quick, nervous rhythm against his ribs, but he consciously forced his posture to relax, leaning his elbow on the table. He needed to look like the victor, the one who was reluctantly letting the loser off easy. "And the Willow project?" David asked, finally breaking the silence, his voice barely audible above the hum of the HVAC unit. Mark couldn't help but exhale a theatrical sigh, loud enough to draw Carol's attention. This was the part that always grated on him, the ridiculous insistence on giving credence to Sarah's hobby. The Willow project was Sarah's passion, a non-profit incubator focused on sustainable, closed-loop technology, primarily involving textile waste and bioremediation. Mark had initially funded the initial startup capital, about $40,000, under the condition that it would remain a side hustle. When her passion threatened to become her sole focus, he'd pulled the plug, claiming it was too much of a financial risk. "The Willow project is negligible, David," Mark stated, addressing the lawyer directly over Sarah's head, a calculated microaggression. "It has no intellectual property of commercial value, 0 tangible assets beyond some donated machinery, and the valuation is essentially 0. Mark is prepared to be generous and list it as a non-marital asset belonging to Sarah, provided we can claim the initial capital investment Mark made as a deduction from the final settlement." Sarah finally spoke, her voice clear and resonant, cutting through the sterile atmosphere. "I don't want the deduction, Mark. You keep the full initial capital. I just want the full, unencumbered rights to the concept, the non-profit registration, and the physical assets in the warehouse." "The physical assets?" Mark scoffed, picking up a cold porcelain coffee mug and twirling it. "You mean the 30-year-old industrial knitting machine and the heap of compost?" "It is a high-efficiency 3D textile printer, Mark, and a microbial culture filtration system," Sarah corrected him, her eyes meeting his for the first time. Her eyes, usually soft and focused on some internal, distant vision, were now sharp, challenging. "And yes, I want them." Carol leaned forward, sensing an opportunity for tactical advantage. "Mark, she's trading a claim on significant marital savings for a junk shop inventory. Accept it. It's a gift." But Mark felt a deep, instinctive resistance. It wasn't about the value of the machines. It was about the principle. He needed Sarah to acknowledge that her dreams were worthless compared to his tangible, career-driven success. He wanted her to feel the sting of sacrificing her true self for a mere fraction of the assets he valued. This negotiation was, for him, a referendum on who was right about their life choices. Subtext: he needed to see her broken to confirm his own superiority. "No, Carol," Mark interjected, ignoring his lawyer's sharp look. He set the coffee mug down, the click echoing in the quiet room. "I'll keep the house and the cars, obviously, but I want the Willow Project IP as a marital asset to be split, and I'll settle for 1/3 of the value of the machinery." He paused, delivering the emotional fantasy, the calculated cruelty. "It's a point of pride, Sarah. You poured 4 years of energy into that. If I can prove it's worth nothing by acquiring it and then dissolving it, maybe you'll finally understand where you went wrong." The air thickened. David Chen was shifting nervously. Sarah's expression, however, remained utterly calm. It was that calmness that infuriated Mark the most, the quiet strength that suggested she wasn't playing his petty game. Sarah looked at the window, out at the city where thousands of ambitious people, much like Mark, were chasing the golden, shimmering prizes of wealth and status. Then her gaze dropped to the table, landing on the small, tarnished vintage gold locket, the one Mark had thrown down earlier. It was a cheap piece, purchased years ago from a vintage market, and the gold plating had started to wear thin, revealing the base metal underneath, much like their marriage. "Fine," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly soft. "I will concede the primary residence, the Porsche, and any claim on the investment portfolio exceeding the prenuptial agreement terms. I will take 0 alimony." Mark's adrenaline spiked. He was winning. He had the house, the car, the prestige. "In exchange," Sarah continued, her voice gaining a steely edge, "I get the full, immediate and exclusive rights to the Willow Project, the physical assets, and crucially, you sign a non-disparagement clause that lasts 5 years, effective today. You never mention my work or my project to anyone, positively or negatively." Complete silence. Carol Vance's eyebrows shot up. "The non-disparagement clause is highly unusual, Mark, but she is giving up nearly $1 million in equity." Mark saw only the house and the car. He saw his future bachelor pad and the symbol of his financial success. He couldn't imagine any scenario where the Willow Project would ever be worth mentioning. It was a meaningless piece of paper to him. He grinned, feeling like the ultimate negotiator. "Done," he said, too quickly. He reached out and snatched the locket from the table, intending to put it in the box of Sarah's junk he'd prepared. But Sarah beat him to it, her hand closing around the small, heavy object. "I'll take that," she said, her fingers curling tight around the chain. "It might be cheap, but it still holds a few memories." It was a line of subtext Mark completely missed. He only heard the word memories and assumed nostalgia. Sarah signed the final document, granting Mark the house. The pen scratched a sound of finality against the heavy paper. Mark watched her stand up, composed, giving David Chen a quiet thank you. She looked smaller, retreating, confirming his assessment that she was sacrificing her stability for a pipe dream. She paused at the door, her hand on the cold steel handle, and looked back at Mark, who was already mentally planning the housewarming party. "Mark," she said, her voice low, "you chose the structure, the gilded cage. I chose the key." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Mark alone with Carol Vance and the heavy silence. He didn't feel guilt. He felt triumphant. He had won the life they had built. He had just exchanged a 7-figure home for a promise of silence about a worthless concept. Mark sat back, letting the emotional fantasy of his success wash over him. He imagined his friends high-fiving him, praising his ruthless efficiency, and commending his foresight. He had shed the dead weight and kept the material gold. Carol Vance, however, was already packing her crocodile skin briefcase. "You made a tactical error agreeing to the non-disparagement clause so easily, Mark. It locks down a potential litigation point." Mark shrugged, dismissing her concern. What's she going to disparage? The fact that she's living in a studio apartment, trading in compost. Relax, Carol. It's over. I won. Carol gave him a long, measuring look, something Mark couldn't quite interpret. Was it admiration for his ruthlessness, or something else? "As you say, Mark, you won." Mark signed the last few papers, feeling the weight of the house keys in his pocket. He was already thinking about the new furniture. He stood up, towering over the mahogany table, and paused to admire the view. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the city in a fierce, aggressive orange. He walked out of the office, already calling his realtor to discuss upgrades. He was so focused on the next step of his grand plan that he didn't notice the sleek, matte black Audi e-tron parked silently at the curb, nor the woman who was quietly loading a small box into the trunk, a box containing the high-efficiency 3D textile printer manuals, before getting into the driver's seat and pulling away with quiet, efficient speed, heading not toward a studio, but toward a future Mark couldn't even fathom. 2 weeks after the signing, Mark was basking in the warm, validating glow of his perceived victory. The former marital home, a sprawling mid-century modern in the exclusive Northwood Hills neighborhood, felt suddenly vast and liberating. He'd painted Sarah's old home office a deep, masculine charcoal gray and replaced her delicate writing desk with a sprawling walnut executive model, instantly converting the space into a power zone. This was the current emotional fantasy. He was a phoenix, shedding the constraints of a stifling marriage and soaring into a new, single, and highly successful life. He decided to christen the new era with a lavish party. "It's a survival of the fittest celebration, buddy," Mark boasted to his friend, Scott Hamilton, a junior partner at his firm, as they moved cases of expensive Argentinian Malbec into the house. "She wanted the compost heap. I kept the castle. It's poetic justice, really." The party was exactly what Mark wanted, loud, packed with colleagues and attractive single acquaintances, and focused entirely on his professional success. He spent the entire night circulating, a glass of amber single malt scotch perpetually in hand, weaving a narrative of how he had selflessly let Sarah walk away with her passion project to protect her from her own financial naivete. He played the martyr, the gracious victor. "She's a wonderful person, truly," Mark told a group of wide-eyed interns, leaning in conspiratorially. "But you know how it is. Sometimes people just get lost chasing abstract ideas. I had to let her go so I could focus on the real game." The guests nodded, their faces reflecting the admiration and pity Mark craved. This confirmation, this external validation of his choices, was his true currency. The morning after the party, the house was a disaster, smelling of stale beer and expensive perfume. Mark woke up with a pounding headache and a deeply satisfying sense of accomplishment. The new house felt like a trophy. Later that week, driving his Porsche through the less affluent, industrial-adjacent neighborhood near the city limits, a shortcut he occasionally took to avoid morning traffic, he caught a glimpse of Sarah. She was standing outside a cramped, aluminum-sided warehouse building, struggling to close the rear hatch of an ancient, forest green Honda CR-V. The kind of car Mark associated with college students and struggling artists. Her hair was tied back messily, and she wore a thick utilitarian work jacket, her hands smudged with what looked like soil or grease. She looked tired, her shoulders hunched against the sharp, icy wind blowing off the river. Mark slowed the Porsche, a surge of smug pity rising in his chest. That's what ambition looks like without backbone, he thought. He had the fleeting emotional fantasy of pulling over, offering her a check, and playing the knight in shining armor to her damsel in distress. I could fix this for her if she'd just admit I was right. Instead, he pressed the accelerator, watching her diminish in his rearview mirror. The image solidified his belief. She was struggling, and he was soaring. He'd made the right decision. Later that afternoon, back in his high-rise office at Meridian Group, Mark couldn't shake the image of the dilapidated Honda. He felt a weird, residual obligation, a need to finalize the clean break, to ensure she was okay, and more importantly, to ensure she wouldn't suddenly show up begging for help. He opened his personal phone and sent a text message, his first direct communication with her since the mediation. 2. Sarah subject. Checking in, hey Sarah. Saw you near the industrial park today. Hope the Willow project is going well. Just wanted to make sure you're settled. The house is finally feeling like mine. If you ever need a little extra capital to help with the culture filtration system, let me know. No strings, of course. Just checking on my old friend. Mark. The reply came back almost instantly, and it was the calm dismissal that stung more than any anger would have. From Sarah, thanks for the offer, Mark. I appreciate the thought, but I'm good. The Willow project is fully funded and moving ahead. Enjoy the house. Mark frowned, rereading the 2 lines. Fully funded. That was impossible. Who would fund that? A local grant, maybe, or a minor environmental foundation. He dismissed it as bravado. Yet, the phrase grated on him. He needed to ensure her funding never grew large enough to make his choice look foolish. His true and unforgivable mistake came the next day, during his company's semi-annual strategy meeting. Mark was pitching a high-stakes, multi-million-dollar proposal to acquire a small, struggling competitor in the logistics sector. The entire deal hinged on securing the competitor's client list. During the Q&A, a senior executive, Mr. Douglas Henderson, questioned Mark about the competitive landscape and the risk of disruptive innovation in their target sector. In a moment of misplaced confidence and petty revenge, Mark decided to use Sarah's project as a dismissive example of a non-threat. Sir, the risk of true disruption is minimal, Mark asserted, clicking to a slide showing vague industry graphs. What we're seeing is a lot of noise, small, idealistic ventures with no scalable business model. Think of it like this. My ex-wife, Sarah, she's a smart woman, but she left a prime financial position to pursue something she called the Willow Project. It's about converting textile waste into sustainable products using microbial culture. Sounds nice, right? But it's fundamentally small-scale, non-commercial, and a completely unproven technology, a hobby she pursued at the expense of her career. He delivered the last word, hobby, with a pointed, condescending laugh, and several people joined in. The general sentiment was, poor, deluded Sarah, saved from herself by the pragmatic Mark. Mark felt a rush of satisfaction. He had, in front of a dozen key decision-makers, solidified the narrative that Sarah and her project were trivial failures. This was his true emotional fantasy, public validation of his life path. That night, feeling particularly arrogant, he decided to double down. Using an anonymous burner email, he sent a short, seemingly innocuous email to several people in Sarah's old professional network, a group of sustainability investors and tech journalists he still kept in touch with. Subject, update on Sarah Mitchell. Just heard Sarah has fully dedicated herself to her non-profit. It sounds like a charming, albeit small, project involving advanced bioremediation of textile waste. Great initiative, but definitely a niche venture. Wishing her luck. He knew exactly what this email would achieve, a subtle, professional poison pill. By labeling it charming and niche, he was communicating to sharp investors that it was not a serious commercial opportunity, only a feel-good passion project. It was a violation of the spirit of the non-disparagement clause, but one he knew was untraceable back to him, and technically didn't contain negative language. This was the point of no return. Mark was actively trying to destroy the foundation of the woman he had promised to leave in peace. He went to bed feeling efficient and secure. The house was quiet, the moon shining through the enormous master bedroom window. He finally felt that satisfying, hollow sense of power. He had control over both his present and her future. 2 days later, Mark received an odd, coded response from one of the tech journalists, a sharp young writer named Anna Reyes, to whom he'd sent his anonymous email. From Anna Reyes, subject, update on Sarah Mitchell. Interesting update. I've heard the Willow Project mentioned in a few very private circles recently. I would be careful labeling anything in the disruptive tech space as charming, especially when the hobby is addressing $1 trillion waste problem. But hey, good luck with your logistics merger. The email was strange. It was overly formal and had a subtle, patronizing tone he didn't like. Very private circles. What did that even mean? He dismissed Anna as overeager, a journalist trying to drum up a story. He poured himself a generous glass of scotch and walked out onto his balcony, looking over his large, perfectly manicured lawn and the surrounding neighborhood of equally impressive homes. He raised his glass to the silent, dark expanse. To winning. In the dark of his garage, however, a small, square cardboard box sat forgotten in the corner. It contained the cheap vintage gold locket Sarah had once treasured, along with some old greeting cards and a collection of ticket stubs, the last vestiges of Sarah's presence in the house. The gold surface, exposed to the air, was already tarnishing further, turning a dull, coppery brown, a perfect symbol of the corrosion Mark had allowed to take hold in his soul. He didn't even remember putting it there. The house felt cold, despite the heating running full blast. Mark shivered, not from the cold, but from a vague, unsettling anxiety he couldn't name. He told himself it was just the stress of the merger. He dismissed the feeling, took a long sip of his drink, and went inside. He was convinced he was happy. 6 months evaporated, taking with them Mark's sense of effortless victory. The glorious bachelor freedom he had envisioned curdled into isolating routine. The house, initially a trophy, now felt like a high-maintenance, echo-filled museum. His job at Meridian Group, once a clear path to the top, had become an anxious holding pattern. The logistics merger he'd championed stalled, and the promotion he was banking on was given to a junior executive from the West Coast office. His emotional fantasies were now ones of quiet desperation. If only I had that promotion, the house would feel less empty. If only I had a partner who appreciated the sacrifice I made for success. He was running on the fumes of past glory. It was a Tuesday afternoon, grey and overcast, the kind of day Mark usually spent trying to look busy in a lukewarm conference call. Bored, he was scrolling through an obscure, hyper-niche industry blog called Future Threads, trying to find any scrap of information about disruptive tech that might bolster his stalled merger proposal. He clicked on an article about emerging materials science. The headline was innocuous: Willow Project nets major seed investment for biopolymer scaling. Mark felt a sudden, cold jolt in his stomach, as if he'd missed a step on a flight of stairs. The Willow Project. He leaned in, his face inches from the screen, dismissing the article immediately as small-time, non-profit news. But the opening paragraph stopped his breath. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, founder and CEO of the Willow Project, announced today the close of a landmark seed round, valuing the sustainable textile to biopolymer company at an estimated $45 million. The investment was led by the notoriously selective venture capital firm, ER Capital. Mark's mind snagged on the valuation, $45 million, and then on the name of the firm, ER Capital. There was only one ER Capital in the world that mattered, the one led by Ethan Rhodes. Ethan Rhodes. The name was whispered with reverence in the highest echelons of the tech and finance worlds. Rhodes was a silent, almost mythical figure, a billionaire known for ruthlessly backing technologies that solved fundamental, systemic, global problems, not just market inefficiencies. He hadn't invested in a seed round in nearly 7 years. Mark scrambled, searching ER Capital Willow Project. The image results loaded, and his blood ran cold. There, on a professional, sleek company press release, was a photograph. Sarah stood at the center, impeccably dressed in a sharp, modern white suit, not the olive-green jacket of the dusty warehouse, her posture confident, radiating an inner, focused intensity Mark had never seen. She was smiling, but it wasn't the tentative smile of his former wife. It was the assured, incandescent smile of someone who was exactly where she was meant to be. And standing next to her, his hand resting casually on a large, shimmering piece of biopolymer textile, was Ethan Rhodes himself. Rhodes, tall and lean, with the kind of custom-tailored suit that looked like it cost more than Mark's annual salary, was looking at Sarah with undisguised respect. The caption beneath the photo read, "Ethan Rhodes, left." And Dr. Sarah Mitchell, CEO, celebrate the partnership that will revolutionize textile sustainability. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Mark felt the world tilt. He had never once, in their 9 years of marriage, heard the prefix doctor attached to her name. He knew she had a master's in environmental science from MIT, but a PhD. He must have blocked it out, or maybe she had never mentioned it, because he had never asked about her work in enough detail to notice. He had always been too busy talking about his own deals, his own promotions, his own valuation. He had dismissed her complex research as abstract ideas. The reveal. The mocked hobby was not a failed non-profit. It was a scalable, patent-pending solution to a trillion-dollar global waste problem, silently cultivated for years, and now validated by the most influential and private investor in disruptive technology. The woman he mocked and discarded was, in fact, a hidden genius, a CEO in the making. Mark felt the icy grip of panic. His mind, trained for financial calculation, quickly processed the true cost of his win. He had traded a 7-figure house for the right to disparage a $45 million company, and rising. The non-disparagement clause he had secured so carelessly now loomed, a legal sword hanging over his head, ready to drop if he spoke a single word about her work to anyone. Just as Mark was desperately trying to process the magnitude of his idiocy, his office phone buzzed. It was his boss, Mr. Henderson, the executive Mark had tried to impress with his cruel dismissal of Sarah's project 6 months prior. "Mark, get down to my office, now, and bring coffee. Strong." Henderson's office was tense. The blinds were drawn, and the only light came from the blue glow of 2 monitors showing bleak merger projections. "This acquisition is falling apart," Henderson muttered, running a hand through his thinning hair. "The due diligence is failing, and our main competitor, Vortex Global, just got a massive capital injection. They're eating up all the market share we needed." Henderson looked at Mark, his face pale with stress. "We need a Hail Mary, Mitchell. I've been trying to get a meeting with ER Capital for 6 months. They are funding a major green tech initiative, and if we can just show Rhodes that our logistics pipeline can support his operations, we might get a partnership that saves this deal and this department." He leaned across his desk, lowering his voice. "I'm talking about Ethan Rhodes, Mark. The guy is a phantom. We need a contact, an introduction, anything. Do you have any peripheral contact in the disruptive tech ecosystem? I mean, I recall you mentioning your ex-wife was dabbling in some environmental stuff. No, forget that. She was just some non-profit volunteer, right? No, we need a real connection." Mark could barely breathe. The words were stuck in his throat like a stone. "Yes, I have a connection. The connection is the woman I just cruelly mocked and forced out of my life, the woman who signed away her claim to my house for the very company you are desperate to save us with." The irony was so thick, so brutal, that it was physically painful. He had used Sarah's work as a symbol of failure to impress this man, and now that same work was the only thing that could save their careers. No, sir," Mark stammered, wiping a clammy hand on his trousers. "No direct contacts with Rhodes. He's very private." Henderson sighed, deflating. "Yes, well, figure it out, Mitchell. Our jobs depend on it. Now get out of here." Mark retreated to his office. The photograph of Sarah and Ethan Rhodes still burned onto his screen. He felt a wave of nausea. All his carefully constructed emotional fantasies of superiority had just been shattered by a single press release. Sarah hadn't been defeated. She had been released. She hadn't traded a castle for compost. She had traded a gilded cage for a launch pad. He closed his laptop abruptly, the click a sharp, final sound. He stood up, pacing his small, glass-walled office, running scenarios through his head. He had to talk to her. He needed to understand how deep this connection went. Would she help him? He immediately violated the letter of the spirit of the non-disparagement clause by calling Scott Hamilton and asking about Dr. Sarah Mitchell, phrasing it as, "Did you know Sarah had finished her PhD?" Scott was as surprised as Mark, cementing the fact that Sarah had kept this quiet for years, even from their mutual friends. Mark realized Sarah was not a victim. She was strategic. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over Sarah's contact number. He needed to apologize, to charm, to manipulate. But before he could, he needed a lever. He needed something personal, something that could momentarily breach the wall of her success. He remembered the locket, the cheap, tarnished, vintage gold locket he had snatched back. It was in that box, tucked away in his dark garage. He would find it, polish it, and use it as a symbol of remorse, a token of shared history. It was a manipulative, desperate plan. But Mark's ambition outweighed his shame. He had won the structure, but Sarah had taken the foundation, and now that foundation was shaking the very skyscraper he worked in. Mark's panic quickly morphed into manic calculation. He was running a risk assessment on his own life, and the numbers were terrifying. His primary asset, his job, his status, was now collateral damage in a silent corporate war that Sarah's success was winning. He spent the next 3 days in a frenzy, trying every possible way to contact Sarah. Emails to her personal address bounced back, redirecting him to a generic info.thewillowproject.com. Calls to her old number went straight to a voicemail box that hadn't been emptied in months. He felt the humiliating, visceral realization that he had not only been erased from her life, but sealed off behind multiple layers of professional success. His attempts were transparent, driven by an escalating series of manipulative emotional fantasies. She misses me. She needs a proper goodbye. She needs my advice on the merger. I can be the supportive ex-husband. He finally found a lever. He remembered the box in the garage. He went home, shedding his tailored suit for worn jeans and a t-shirt, and descended into the cold, dusty garage, a space he usually treated as a glorified parking spot. He located the square cardboard box, shoved behind a stack of old tires. It was labeled, in Sarah's neat handwriting, miscellaneous. He dug through the contents, old photo albums, concert ticket stubs, and finally, at the bottom, wrapped in a faded velvet pouch, was the vintage gold locket. He pulled it out. It was worse than he remembered. The plating was almost completely gone on the edges, leaving a sickly green copper patina. He opened it. Inside, the 2 small, blurry photos they had put in a decade ago, one of him looking arrogant, one of her looking sweetly hopeful, were yellowed and curled at the edges. The locket was a perfect, terrible symbol of their marriage, beautiful on the surface, but cheap, tarnished, and decaying underneath. He spent an hour trying to clean it with a polishing cloth, attempting to restore the superficial gleam, much like he was attempting to polish his own shattered image. It didn't work. It just looked like a cheap piece of jewelry someone had tried too hard to save. Mark decided he would use the locket anyway. The emotional weight of the object, the memories Sarah had mentioned, would be his weapon. He crafted a text message, agonizing over every word. To Sarah, via new professional contact form. Sarah, this is Mark. I found something of yours I know you cherish, the locket. I realize now how much I neglected what was truly valuable in our lives. I'm sending this to your business contact because I can't reach you personally. I need to return it. More importantly, I need to apologize. I owe you that. Can we meet for 10 minutes? Before our final decree meeting next week. He pressed send, feeling a repulsive cocktail of self-pity and entitlement. I'm trying to apologize, he convinced himself. I'm trying to do the right thing. The subtext, however, was simple. I need to access your billionaire investor and save my job, and you are my only key. The response came not from Sarah, but from a different number, marked with a Canadian area code. From unknown number. Mark, this is Lisa, Dr. Mitchell's executive assistant. Dr. Mitchell is traveling extensively this week for expansion talks in Europe and is unavailable. Regarding the final decree next Tuesday, please ensure you and your counsel are present at 10 a.m. sharp. David Chen will handle all logistics. The matter of the locket is personal and irrelevant to the legal closure. Please handle it as you see fit. The dismissiveness was total. He was being handled by an assistant, and a foreign one at that, confirming Sarah was playing on a global field. The mention of Dr. Mitchell and expansion talks in Europe hammered home the chasm between their lives. Then came the true escalation. Mark received a terse memo from Mr. Henderson. The final acquisition documents for their logistics merger were being signed next Thursday. If Meridian Group couldn't secure a strategic partner, specifically a green tech partnership that would satisfy the new board's sustainability mandate, Henderson's department was going to be dissolved, and Mark, as the failed deal leader, would be the first casualty. The final divorce decree meeting was on Tuesday. The merger signing was on Thursday. He had 2 days between the two events to secure a lifeline. Mark remembered reading that the Willow Project was holding a small public launch celebration for their new seed funding and European office expansion at a local innovation hub downtown this coming Wednesday, the night before the merger signing. It was meant to be a low-key press event, but Mark knew this was the only opportunity. Ethan Rhodes was notoriously meticulous about attending the public unveilings of his major investments. The new emotional fantasy took hold. I will crash the event. I will corner Sarah, apologize sincerely, and use our shared history, the locket, to appeal to her better nature. I will then use her connection to get 5 minutes with Rhodes, save my career, and later, when I'm successful again, I will repay her. She will respect my tenacity. He spent Monday choosing his clothes, honing his narrative, and practicing the look of deep, sincere remorse in the mirror. He chose a dark suit, impeccably tailored, projecting success and stability. He meticulously wrapped the tarnished locket in a small, black velvet box, planning to present it with maximum dramatic effect. Tuesday morning arrived, the day of the final decree. Mark arrived at the lawyer's office alone, Carol Vance having pulled out, citing conflict of interest over the failing merger. He signed the final papers with David Chen, the whisperer, who didn't even make eye contact. The divorce was legally over, but Mark's inner turmoil was just beginning. That evening, Mark was at the gym, going through a punishing set of deadlifts, trying to channel his rising anxiety into physical exertion. He was watching the news ticker on the gym's TV when an item flashed across the screen. Breaking. Vortex Global secures key green tech partnership. Positioning for major acquisition. The screen cut to a quick, grainy shot of a sleek, glass-walled building. The exact location of the Willow Project's launch event tomorrow night. Mark dropped the barbell with a deafening crash, the weights slamming into the rubber floor. He hadn't just lost the divorce, and he hadn't just lost his job. He was about to discover that Sarah's success was directly and surgically responsible for the dismantling of his entire professional life. He was officially out of time. There was no turning back. Tomorrow night, he would crash the party, make his appeal, and attempt the most desperate maneuver of his career. He left the gym, ignoring the stairs, and drove home. He walked straight to the garage, retrieving the little black box holding the tarnished vintage gold locket. He clutched it, its cheap weight suddenly feeling immense. He would use the symbol of their failure to secure his future, one last toxic act of ambition. The Innovation Hub, a sleek monument of glass and polished concrete, hummed with the energy of success. Mark stood across the street, his heart thudding a hard, erratic rhythm against his ribs. The setting was the antithesis of the stuffy marble office where he'd mocked Sarah 6 months prior. This space was bright, open and forward-looking, filled with the scent of sustainable catering and the low murmur of high-stakes conversation. It was Wednesday night. The air was cool but electric. Mark, looking successful, but feeling fraudulent in his dark suit, took a deep breath. He held the small, velvet-covered box containing the tarnished vintage gold locket tightly in his left inner pocket. His desperate talisman. He walked across the street and into the lobby, slipping past a harried-looking security guard by feigning a phone call about a prearranged meeting with Dr. Mitchell. The main event floor was breathtaking. Sarah was on a small, elevated stage, giving a presentation. She was in a tailored suit, a confident anchor in the sea of buzzing attendees. Her talk was not about composting. It was about global supply chain integration, biopolymer synthesis, and sustainable industrial scaling. She spoke with fluent authority about multinational legislation and disruptive market potential, a language Mark barely understood. He watched her for a full minute, struck by the transformation. The quiet, inward-focused Sarah he knew was gone, replaced by a radiant, powerful CEO. Her hands moved confidently as she spoke, and Mark noticed she was wearing a simple, high-quality, unadorned silver chain around her neck, a stark contrast to the cheap gold he carried. Suddenly, the room hushed as a tall, impeccably tailored man entered from a side door. It was Ethan Rhodes. He didn't make a scene. He simply walked to the front row, nodded once to Sarah, and took a seat, radiating an aura of untouchable wealth and focused attention. Mark felt his stomach drop. Rhodes's presence was immediate, magnetic, and intimidating. This is it, Mark thought, the final emotional fantasy kicking in. I will wait for her to step off the stage, catch her alone, offer the locket as a silent apology for the past, and leverage that moment of shared history to ask for the Rhodes introduction. Mark positioned himself near the stage exit, feeling the intense glare of the nearby lighting. He was completely focused on Sarah. Then, the final, brutal moment arrived. As Sarah wrapped up her talk, a question was asked from the audience about market timing. She answered eloquently, explaining her company's strategic decision to secure global regulatory approval before launching in key markets. Just as she was stepping down, Mark spotted a massive, matte black vehicle, the kind of unmarked, intimidating luxury sedan Mark had only ever seen in financial news photos, pulling silently up to the curb right outside the glass wall. It was a customized Maybach, easily worth $500,000, with tinted, bulletproof windows. It wasn't parking, it was waiting to pick her up. Mark froze. He had imagined Sarah taking an Uber or, at best, a taxi. This was beyond his comprehension. The sheer, silent power of that waiting vehicle was a physical manifestation of the chasm he had ignorantly created. He had no more time to think. Sarah was walking toward him, shaking hands with people, Ethan Rhodes moving slowly toward her from the front. Mark intercepted her just as she approached a quiet corner. He forced a contrite smile, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled out the black velvet box. Sarah. Dr. Mitchell, he corrected himself, the title feeling like a mouthful of ash. Sarah stopped it. She didn't look startled, just intensely weary. Her composure was absolute. Mark, I received your assistant's message. We're closed. Please, just 10 seconds, Mark pleaded, holding out the black box. I found this. I know what it meant to you. I wanted to return it. It represents so much of what I failed to see. His voice caught, less from manufactured emotion and more from the sheer, sudden weight of his impending failure. I failed to see you, Sarah. I was focused on the wrong things. Please accept my sincere apology. He opened the box. The tarnished gold, dull and green against the pristine black velvet, looked shameful under the bright, modern lights. Sarah looked down at the locket. Her expression softened, but not with nostalgia, with clear, objective pity. It was a cheap gift, Mark, she said quietly. It was never real gold. Subtext, the truth of their relationship was exposed, finally, for what it was. Before Mark could respond, Ethan Rhodes arrived, gliding silently up beside Sarah. He stopped, not acknowledging Mark, but addressing Sarah with a voice that was quiet, deep and held the full weight of a multi-billion-dollar empire. "Sarah," Rhodes said, using her first name, with a familiarity that felt devastatingly exclusive. "Vortex Global just closed their funding round. Our analysis suggests they're using a competing, highly inefficient carbon capture system. Thank you for pushing us to scale faster. You have saved my entire sustainable portfolio from a costly pivot." Rhodes finally glanced at Mark, his eyes cool and utterly devoid of recognition. "And who is this?" Sarah looked from the billionaire to the man holding the tarnished box, and then back to Rhodes. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug, as if dismissing a minor inconvenience. "Mr. Rhodes, this is Mark, an acquaintance from a former life. Mark, this is Ethan Rhodes." Mark extended his hand, desperate. "Mr. Rhodes, I'm Mark Mitchell from Meridian Group. We're in logistics, and we're looking to partner with green tech initiatives. I was hoping—" Rhodes didn't take the hand. He simply inclined his head. "Mark, logistics. I'm familiar with Meridian Group. They failed to secure a key logistics merger, and, I believe, are about to be acquired by a competitor with a much more forward-thinking strategy. That strategy, incidentally, involves partnering with the Willow Project in Q2. The words landed like physical blows. Rhodes had not only heard of Mark's firm, but was perfectly informed of its impending collapse, and Sarah's company was the future Meridian Group had failed to become. Sarah gently closed the velvet box in Mark's hand. "You can keep the locket, Mark. It's yours now. I don't need things that only look good on the surface." She tapped the simple, high-quality silver chain around her own neck. "This is real." Rhodes put his hand lightly on Sarah's back, a gesture of partnership and respect, not romance. "The Maybach is waiting, Dr. Mitchell. We have a private jet to catch." Mark watched, frozen in place. The Maybach, the powerful, silent, black car that symbolized absolute, unassailable success, was not for Rhodes, but for Sarah. The two turned and walked away. Mark stood, holding the tarnished box, watching them move toward the glass wall. The security guard opened the door, and the cool evening air rushed in. Sarah slid into the back seat of the Maybach, Ethan Rhodes following. The engine purred, the car pulled silently away, leaving Mark standing alone in the center of a room full of people who were all celebrating the woman he had destroyed his life trying to diminish. He had mocked her over a car and a house, and she had traded them for a Maybach and a private jet. Mark finally realized the depth of his mistake. The hard karma had hit. He retreated immediately, leaving the sleek, forward-thinking innovation hub behind, carrying the cheap, tarnished locket, the literal symbol of his own fake gold life. Mark didn't go home. He went to a high-end, near-empty bar a few blocks from the innovation hub. He sat at a corner table, staring into a glass of untouched scotch, the small, tarnished black velvet box resting beside his coaster. The ice clinked in his glass, the only sound in his universe that wasn't the ringing shame in his ears. He replayed the last 20 minutes on an agonizing loop. Sarah's quiet authority, Rhodes's precise, surgical dismissal of Meridian Group, and the silent, overwhelming power of the waiting Maybach. The Maybach is waiting, Dr. Mitchell. The realization was a heavy, inescapable weight. He hadn't just lost a divorce. He had utterly misjudged his wife's value, mistaken her intellectual discipline for a quaint hobby, and in doing so, he had engineered his own downfall. He had wanted external validation of his superiority, and the universe had responded with hard, immediate karma, proving his inferiority in the only arena he cared about: business acumen and foresight. The next morning, the corporate axe fell. Mark walked into his office to find a termination notice waiting. The merger had collapsed, thanks to Vortex Global securing the very green tech partnership Mark's team had failed to secure. Henderson's department was dissolved. Mark's severance was generous, a final, hollow compensation for a career he had ruined himself. He went home to his trophy house, which now felt less like a castle and more like a mausoleum. He sat in his massive, charcoal-grey office, the power zone, staring at the expansive walnut desk. The silence was deafening. There were no colleagues to call, no clients to charm, no social hierarchy left to climb. He picked up the locket. The tarnished gold felt gritty beneath his fingers. He had used it as a tool, a manipulative prop, but now, stripped of its intended purpose, it held only truth. It was fake gold. And so, Mark finally admitted, was the entire gilded structure he had built his life upon. His ambition was a plating, his success a costume. The resolution began not with a grand gesture, but with a series of quiet, painful surrenders. First, the house. He couldn't afford the maintenance, the taxes, or the pretense of living there without the salary. More importantly, he couldn't stand the sight of it. It was a tangible reminder of the price of his arrogance. He listed it immediately, accepting an offer that was less than he'd hoped, but quick and clean. He sold the Porsche and bought a reliable, modest hybrid sedan. The second, more difficult surrender was the apology. It wasn't the manipulative one he had rehearsed for Rhodes. It was the one he owed himself and Sarah. He typed it out on his personal laptop, not his corporate one, focusing on humility rather than expectation. 2. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, via generic Willow Project contact. Subject: an apology with no expectation of reply. Sarah, I am writing this from a place of genuine, unadulterated shame. I received my termination notice this morning. I lost the job, and I'm losing the house. I tell you this not for sympathy, but to give context to what I'm about to say. You told me once that I chose the structure, and you chose the key. I see that now. I chose the structures that crumbled and ignored the foundation you were building. I mocked your work because I was terrified of anything that didn't fit my narrow definition of success, and I resented that your worth was intrinsic, not manufactured. I'm sorry for the cruelty, the dismissiveness, and the calculated attempts to undermine you. You are brilliant, and I hope the Willow Project changes the world, because I know you will. I will not contact you again. This is not a plea for connection or a request for help. It is simply an acknowledgement of my profound failure and a wish for your complete and deserved success. Mark. He hit send and immediately blocked the email address. He didn't want a reply. He only wanted to be honest. The act of writing it was cleansing, like lancing an emotional infection. He spent the next few months dismantling his old life. He took a lower-paying job as a business development associate for a regional non-profit that focused on community solar energy, a job that was humble but required him to look outward, not upward. He moved into a small, sunlit two-bedroom apartment near the local park, trading the sweeping, empty views of the city for the sounds of children and the smell of cut grass. One evening, he was packing the last of the boxes from his old life, mostly corporate awards and discarded business books, when he came across the locket again. He picked it up and, instead of trying to save it, he walked over to the garbage bin and dropped it in. It hit the bottom with a tiny, hollow thud. He had stopped trying to polish fake gold. The house was empty now, sold and awaiting the new owners. Mark sat on the floor, looking out the back window at the vast, perfectly maintained lawn that he had spent years obsessing over. He realized he had never once just sat and enjoyed the space. He had only ever seen it as an asset, a line item on his balance sheet of life. Now he was poorer, but for the first time in a decade, he felt a genuine sense of peace. The structures were gone, and he was left with only the simple, flawed, and, finally, authentic foundations of himself. He took a deep breath of the cool evening air, his mind quiet. His resolution was painful, but it was real. What an incredible story of ambition, karmic reckoning, and finding true resilience. Mark learned the hardest lesson. That true value is intrinsic, not something you can buy, sell, or mock. Sarah's strength, hidden beneath the surface, became her launch pad, leaving us with an inspiring message. Never trade your authentic passion for someone else's definition of success. If this dramatic, filmic story about finding connection and authenticity resonated with you, and if you think Mark's redemption was earned, please do us a favor. Like this video, share it with a friend who needs a reminder about resilience, and hit that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments below. What was the biggest mistake Mark made? And what do you think is Sarah's next billion-dollar move?